Great to see everyone. A couple things we're going to try to really blitz through today because we have about 35 minutes. Do about 15 minutes presentation, 20 minutes presentation on kind of the status of homelessness and how we got here, and then try to get as many questions answered as possible. And the other thing, since as Matt said, this is an incredibly complicated topic and governance in LA is diffuse and messy, is that, you know, if you have questions along the way, you have control over your own mute. So if you want to just quickly unmute yourself and shoot a question in, if I've jumped a topic too quick or you're confused, please do that. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is answer a handful of questions that you have either probably had or maybe have heard people asked. So questions such as, you know, why is it so hard to build homeless housing? You know, there's this person on the street that's clearly having a mental health crisis. Why are you not helping them? Why are there so many homeless people? Why is it so visible? You know, why is the city or county or state or feds not doing more? So those are some of the questions we're going to attempt to answer. And then the one thing I'll add that Matt had asked me to talk about previously was what the city council does. So the city council, as Matt mentions, 15 members. We're the legislative branch for the city of LA. So the mayor is the executive branch. We don't have a judicial branch particularly. Other than the city attorney, I guess you could say. And then the legislative branch is just like any other, you know, working to pass laws throughout the city. The main difference is that the city council in LA is very powerful compared to other city councils. Each council member covers a district of close to 300,000 people. That's the biggest district per council member size in the entire nation. And it's too big. Really, we should be 25, 35 members on the city council to be a better governed city. But voters in 1999, when they last had a chance to expand the city council, said more politicians? Absolutely not, and didn't do that, which means everyone's voice is more diluted because of the size. And it is one of the problems that we have. So I'm going to jump right into it and start our presentation. So give me one sec here. All right, is everyone seeing a screen that looks like it's talking about homelessness?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, cool. So I'm going to start by talking about how we got here, the causes of homelessness, and then jump from there to where we are now and where we're going. So first and foremost, we have so many homeless in Los Angeles in particular because of poverty. The biggest driver of homelessness is poverty. It's a poverty crisis first and foremost. There are a lot of other correlated causes and exacerbating factors, but almost all of them stem from poverty at the very base. California is the highest poverty state in the nation, and LA is one of the highest poverty cities in the nation. We have huge wealth and huge poverty. Some of the big reasons for long-term poverty in the city: housing costs are extremely high in coastal California, and of course, structural racism has been pervasive in California for its entire history. Just a quick snapshot to encapsulate that. Poverty is particularly acute, as you can imagine, amongst Black and brown families. The median net worth of an African-American family in Los Angeles is $4,000. For a Mexican-American family, it is $3,500. Compare that to a white family, $350,000. And that, of course, explains pretty easily why African-Americans make up 4 times the homeless population compared to their share of the overall population, 33% compared to having a share of just under 10%. On the housing front, housing costs have continued to increase for the last several years, last several decades, and there's a few reasons for that, and it is the biggest driver of homelessness, especially today. One of those reasons is low housing production. People moved to California, we didn't build enough units, a lot more demand than there is supply, that drives up prices. Another thing that has stopped the increase of prices is that there are limits on rent control. So if you live in a rent controlled apartment or what's called RSO in LA City, you know, your rents can only increase a certain amount. Most apartments are not, or many apartments are not under rent control. And the third big reason is there's just not a huge amount of federal assistance to help people get rental housing. And the reason that there's not a lot of federal assistance is not because there aren't programs, there are, like Section 8, it's that they don't adjust very well for local costs. The Section 8 vouchers in LA are just worth less than they're valued in other places. And even if you get a Section 8 voucher, and it's a huge lottery to get it, it's a real luck of the draw if you manage to get one, there are many people that aren't able to even find a place to use their voucher within the 2 years before they expire. All of that is why the economically homeless are the largest share of homeless in the city and the county of Los Angeles. The other thing I want to mention on economically homeless in particular is that when we talk about people who are homeless, unhoused, the term that the government uses is PEH, people experiencing homelessness. And we use that term not just because government can't help itself and loves to create acronyms out of everything, but is because homelessness is predominantly transitory. So last year, about 23,000 people were housed through various programs through homelessness. Another 50,000 plus or so found their own way out of homelessness, and 80,000 people became homeless. That's why the numbers are increasing. But the fact that 50,000 got out of homelessness on their own is a good reminder that most people are homeless for weeks, months, maybe a couple of years. They're not necessarily the share that are called chronically homeless, that are there year after year, and maybe what you're thinking of when you think of unhoused neighbors on our streets. A lot of those people are using their cars temporarily. They're sleeping on friends' couches. They're couch surfing. This is something that's personal to me or to my family. And my wife was homeless for almost a year in that circumstance, living out of her car and on friends' couches and sofas because she was also going through something we'll talk about in a minute, which is a mental health crisis. She was diagnosed as bipolar in her late teens, early 20s. And that was a huge change to her life. It was hard for her family to deal with. And, eventually they said that she needed to find her own way. And I asked her if she was willing for me to share that story because it's a good reminder that, homelessness has a lot of different faces and isn't always what we think of or what we see. Some of the other big causes of homelessness or exacerbating factors, I just mentioned mental health, of course, and substance abuse being another driver. Bottom left here is just some data on kind of what the low and high margins are of how many people that are experiencing homelessness, suffer from these afflictions. Whether it's mental health, substance abuse, or just an overall health condition, the estimates are from anywhere between a quarter to 3/4, depending on the study you look at, are at some stage of experiencing one of these factors. Often there's comorbidities. They have both or all three. Real quickly, like the history of mental health is kind of important here as to how we got so many people on the streets that have mental health afflictions, or really more accurately, why we haven't been able to help so many people that have mental health afflictions. Back in the 60s, Medicaid and Medicare was established, great programs. One of the things that did was it basically said you could get funding and coverage for people if they had mental health afflictions, but not if they're in a state institution. So the state over that time, Reagan in 67 with the LPS law, started moving people out of asylums and into communities, and under the idea that we'd have community health centers and care, and they were correct that community care was better, but they never really funded it. It never really came about in the way it should have. 1980, Carter tried to expand on JFK's dream with the Mental Health Systems Act that would have really helped. In 1981, Reagan became president and repealed it. So basically, we had this shift of people into neighborhoods, but no funding to follow it. And that meant just a growing mental health crisis in our communities. In 2004, so we're talking 40 years later, the state of California tried to help a bit and passed, 53% of the voters passed the Mental Health Services Act, which is also known as Prop 63. Brings in about $10 billion a year now. It was a 1% tax on millionaires. And at the time that it was passed, 50,000 mentally ill people were unhoused on our streets. So that's been an issue for a long time. So what happens with that money and money overall for social services? Well, as Matt was mentioning earlier, the city handles what we call municipal services, things like roads, transportation, street repair, tree trimming, police and fire, that kind of thing. The county, which covers that 10 million person region, covers all your social services. So mental health, public health, social, DPSS, Department of Public Social Services, DCFS, Child and Family Services. They cover all the things that you would think of as social services, the safety net. They hand out welfare checks, all those kinds of things. So just on the mental health, public health, social services side, they have a $10 billion plus budget, 10,000 plus staff. $10 billion plus is actually the exact same size as the city's general fund budget. So the county budget dwarfs the city's by quite a bit. So one of the questions we often get is, why aren't you helping this person who is clearly suffering a mental health crisis? We've probably all seen it when we're around the city. And it's a great question. It's a frustrating question for really everybody, providers, elected officials, community members, and unhoused individuals themselves. So the main reason that we're not necessarily able to help somebody, depending on how you define help, is because the state law back in, the LPS law in 1967, the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act, basically took the pendulum on, how we treated mental health, which back then just put people into asylums, often really who shouldn't have been, and they were terrible. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a movie that kind of highlighted that, and basically switched the pendulum to the other side, which made it almost impossible to commit somebody or require treatment. And what it basically said was in the LPS laws, there were only 3 ways that you could require treatment of somebody. It was if they were either trying to kill somebody else, trying to hurt somebody, trying to hurt themselves, or gravely mentally ill. And that phrase was ill-defined, and so it's never used. But it basically meant if you're committing slow suicide, you're clearly very sick, you need help, but you may not want help, or you may not know that you may not be able to consent for various reasons. So the county's been working to try to expand that definition to allow for some additional treatment, even if a person's not fully able to consent. But there's obviously a lot of concerns over that because you want to be very careful about treating someone potentially against their will. So that's one of the debates that's continually ongoing about how to help people that are gravely mentally ill. Quick quiz that'll help us move into the next topic. Does anyone know the name of the largest mental health hospital in LA County? You can just unmute and shout it out.
Is it USC, County USC, or?
Not County USC.
Is it at the VA?
Not the VA, but that's a good guess. I'll give you one more and then we'll jump into it.
I'm gonna go with the prison.
Yep, it is Men's Central. Men's Central Jail. So yes, whoever said the prison. Our largest mental health hospital in LA County is our Central Jail in downtown LA, which gives you a real good look at what problems we have to dig ourselves out of. So that brings me to incarceration. That's another large driver of homelessness, and particularly the inability to get out of homelessness. We're all probably well aware about 1990s, tough on crime bills, plenty before that, of course. People that are incarcerated have lower job prospects. It's hard to keep a roof over their heads after release. And each year, 50,000 people are released in this country from jail or prison, and they go straight to homeless shelters because they have nowhere else to go. The county has been working hard over the last couple decades to try to address this issue and try to be better about reintegration and diversion. That's included some things like what's called the LA Regional Reentry Partnership, which has the acronym LARP, which if you're a nerd or a geek will mean a totally different thing to you. It's meant things like Prop 47 and 57, which are state ballot measures that most of us probably voted for to help reduce sentencing, so we stop sending so many people to jail. It's meant the LA's Fair Chance Hiring Ordinance, which is a City of LA law, although I believe the county has it as well. That's also called Ban the Box being that little checkbox that you've probably seen on university applications or job applications that says, have you ever been arrested or convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony? We banned that, so you can't ask that question anymore. So if you do see it on something, do let me know, because they're not supposed to be doing that. But all of that was trying to make it so it's easier. Once you've done your time, you should be able to reintegrate in society. Whether that time in the first place was a good idea or not, is a different conversation. But all these efforts trying to make it easier to reintegrate so that we don't have so many folks going from this prison to homelessness pipeline. And then finally, juvenile diversion has been a big priority of the county. Youth arrests in LA County fell from 56,000 in 2005, which it's mind-blowing to me that many people were arrested as youth in 2005, to 11,000 in 2016. And that was even before the county took up formal diversion as like a policy in 2017. So that's how we got here, right? Those are all causes of homelessness. Many of them you're probably aware of. So where are we right now? So as of today, in the last homeless count, which takes place every year in February, we have 66,000 people homeless in LA County. 18,000 of them are sheltered, so they're in shelters, bridge home sites, various forms of non-long-term housing. And LAUSD housed 23 people last year. However, homelessness still went up. And as I mentioned before, it's because more people became homeless than those that were either housed or found their own way out of homelessness. But what's important to note is that homelessness is not new. This is not a crisis that only cropped up the last 7 years. That chart obviously shows that there was substantial increases, but that's an increase after the 2008 recession dropped housing prices and homelessness reduced. Back in 2005, the homeless count actually counted 82,000 people homeless in LA County with only 10,000 shelters. So it's actually worse 15 years ago. But why does it seem so much more visible? Why does it feel worse now? And don't get me wrong, it's bad now. It's not to say that somehow things are fine now. They're not at all. They just have been worse in the past. And what's important to know about 2005 and before that is that basically the government policy, whether it was cities, county, law enforcement, or even private hospitals, the policy was just to basically ghettoize people in Skid Row. They would do patient dumping. So if you were a hospital, someone came into the ER because they were having a mental health crisis, or they were just, overall unhealthy, because that happens a lot if you're living on the streets in the open air. Once they treated that person, that was an expensive patient. They're not likely to have health insurance, and they're probably not able to pay out of pocket. So the hospital would just dump that person in Skid Row, hoping that they wouldn't migrate back to, wherever that hospital was and end up back in the ER. Law enforcement did the same thing, whether it was Beverly Hills, different parts of LA City, other parts of the county. Law enforcement would just either, when people were released from jail or released from arrest, drop them off in Skid Row. And basically, there was this kind of de facto rule that said, look, if you're in Skid Row, we're not going to bother you. But if you're in other parts of the city or the county, you're going to get harassed because we don't want to see you. And so even though there were homeless throughout the county, you didn't necessarily see them as frequently because they kept a low profile. Right now, though, they don't have to. And there's a couple of reasons for that, other than the fact that it was unethical what the government was doing before. In 2007, the court stepped in and basically said, what you're doing, city, county, is illegal. So there was a case called Jones versus Los Angeles that was litigated over a section of the city municipal code called 4118. That's a section of the city code that almost every city in the country has, that is a sit, lie, or sleep law. And it basically says you can't sit, lie, or sleep blocking a public sidewalk. And it's essentially criminalization of homelessness. The courts, justifiably and correctly, said, yeah, that's a constitutional violation, Fourth Amendment and probably some others. You can't criminalize someone's status as a homeless person if you have given them no options. What is that person supposed to do? You've told them they can't sit, lie, or sleep here, but they don't have a home, they can't afford a home, and you're not providing them a home, so you've left them no options. That's not okay. And so the Jones settlement for the city of LA said the city wouldn't enforce that law until it had built enough housing units. Now, this only applied to the city. So other cities in LA County didn't have to comply with this. So they would still kick people out of their city and move them back to LA. One of the reasons why LA City has a higher homeless proportion than the county. In 2019, there was a case, Martin v. Boise, Idaho, that was basically the same case, except for it was a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case, which means that when the Ninth Circuit said basically the same thing that was said in Jones, it applied to all the Western states. There was actually a number of cities and states and private lawyers that tried to take it to the Supreme Court and get it overturned. The Supreme Court said, we're not going to hear it. As the LA Times put it, Supreme Court leaves cities with one option on homelessness: more housing. So if you wanted to not allow homelessness on your streets, you had to provide housing. And there are cities that do this. So for example, if you go to Beverly Hills, you are not going to see tents in Beverly Hills. And that's because Beverly Hills literally every single day tracks how many beds they've got available. And they always make sure they have enough, and they've built enough beds or contracted enough beds that anyone they offer housing to, they can give them housing, and thus they can enforce their no camping law. And they do. So there are cities that are out there that still criminalize homelessness. Now, the debate, of course, would be and will be for many cities that aren't able to do that is, should they? That's not an open question for everyone to think about. Trying to address homelessness in LA, one of the big questions is who's in charge, right? To fix a problem, you usually have to have a good, solid command structure of who's actually responsible to address it. It's also one of the biggest problems in Los Angeles. Going back to what Matt started with, LA is a diffuse, decentralized system of governance. It was deliberately made that way. It was made that way so a Robert Moses type out of New York, those types of more centralized control could not exist in Los Angeles. It was predominantly made that way by developers and homeowners associations and various people that didn't want to see a centralized city hall with lots of power. And so unlike in New York or Chicago, where the mayor covers the school system and a lot of the social services, or even in San Francisco, where it's a city county, LA, right where you're standing, wherever you're standing, you've probably got a city council member, a mayor, a supervisor, a school board member, and a handful of other agencies, Metropolitan Transit Authority. All of those are run by totally different elected officials in a very diffuse system. So it's hard to handle some of these big region-wide crises because no one's in charge. So for homelessness, that's definitely true. It's sort of the mayor, it's sort of the supervisors, it's sort of the county CEO, it's sort of the head of LAUSD. But it's not any of them in particular. And one of the pieces of legislation that our office has introduced was to actually change the city's charter to actually just give more power to the mayor, so at least someone would be in charge, as opposed to even in LA, we have 15 districts that are very powerful and everyone does things their own way. LAUSD, which is the main agency that oversees homelessness and trying to address homelessness, the LA Homeless Services Authority, is actually indicative of this entire problem. The only reason LAUSD exists is because in 1993, the city had sued the county and said, hey, county, there's a lot of unhoused people in our city. They need social services and you're not providing enough. We're gonna sue you because you're not doing your job. And the judge basically brokered a settlement where this joint powers authority was created between the city and the county. And the city and the county both appoint people who sit on the LAUSD commission, and then they appoint an executive director. And so you in the first 10 years that LAUSD even existed, it was basically a political football because no one wanted to be in charge of an intractable problem that they were going to get tagged with. So that's kind of the underlying structure of why this has been such a challenge. Here's where some strides have been made forward. 2 big ballot measures were approved in 2017, 2018 time period. If you were in LA City, all of us voted to approve Measure HHH by about 70% to 30%. That was a bond measure, which means it can only be used for capital projects. So we can build housing with it, we can't staff those projects. $1.2 billion to build 7,000 units of permanent supportive housing. It's supposed to be 10, but cost overruns, land availability challenges, and community opposition has meant that the city's only getting to about 7,000. Measure H is the companion measure that was countywide. Quarter-cent sales tax increase, raises about $1/3 of $1 billion every year, and that funds the services that we need at those properties. So if you create a PSH, a permanent supportive housing, which is the most expensive types of housing for unhoused individuals because it is going to have case managers and offices built in and classes and things because it's for someone who has high acuity, has high needs. We need staff, and that's what Measure H does. So also thank everyone on this call for hopefully voting for those 2 measures. Other things happening right now, you've probably heard about Project Room Key. That was an effort to put people into hotel rooms during the COVID pandemic. Depending on how you look at Project Room Key, it's been successful or not successful. Its goal was 10,000 or 15,000, I can't recall. Fell well short of that. They got about 3,800 rooms. 3,000 is a little bit of a low ball here. On the other hand, that's a lot of rooms in a short period of time. And what's interesting is that there was you might have seen on the internet, some people pushing for hotels to be, what's the word for it, eminent domain, taken over by the government to make there be more rooms. But what's ironic is that the number of hotels that were interested in participating wasn't the problem. It was the number of staff that there was to actually man the hotels, figure out how to negotiate all the leases. It was county and LAUSD staff that there weren't enough of. And that's one of the challenges when we're trying to ramp programs up very quickly is that you need 3 things. You need the money, which we had in this case. You need the properties, which we actually did have enough hotels interested in participating. You also need staff to make all those programs work. And that was where they were falling behind. LAUSD and the county is now shifting to a COVID recovery plan, which our office is extremely excited about, which is going to look to do 15,000 rentals of market rate units. So basically going out into neighborhoods, your neighborhood, and find units that are available, rent them, and put unhoused people in them. For our district, that's very exciting because CD4, Council District 4, is very expensive in terms of land cost. And so even though we've got more housing projects, we have the most bridge home projects tied for in the city, it's hard to get the total number of units by building individual buildings just because there's no land that's available for purchase. And so having scattered site housing, which is what this is called, will make it more likely that we can get more units in our district, which we'd like to see. The other bright spot is that LAUSD is housing more people than ever before. They housed 23,000 people last year, which is a lot. Some of the ongoing challenges, we're still seeing, of course, a push and pull, we'll probably always will, between advocates and communities. So there's debates over cleanups to keep areas clean and sanitary and make sure that there's sidewalk space so somebody with a stroller can walk through. Or the other word that's used, which is sweeps, the idea that cleanups are just meant to sweep the homeless away so that the area looks clean again. You know, those are constant battles and debates. And then encampment management, you know, how do you, you've got these encampments that are growing. You might have seen that during the course of the pandemic, a lot of encampments have swelled in size. And so it's just a question of, you know, what is the right way to manage encampments? Those are ongoing challenges and debates. Another ongoing debate is the role of law enforcement. The challenge here is that, you know, law enforcement plays a large role currently in managing and helping with, you could argue, homelessness. It's the challenge is there's only one type of 24/7 responder available in the city and the county. And it's either, you know, paramedics and fire if it's a medical issue. And if it's anything else, it's law enforcement. No one else works 24/7. So that's led to increasing conflicts between law enforcement and unhoused neighbors. Everyone wants law enforcement out of homeless outreach work, including law enforcement. They don't think that they're right for the job. That's not what they signed up for, what they're trained for. Elected officials, communities generally don't think that they're right for the job. The issue is that there needs to be work done to actually create staff that work 24/7 to help with the issues that happen at 2 in the morning. And so that'll require renegotiating collective bargaining contracts with county unions over social workers, mental health workers, LAUSD outreach workers to ensure that they actually work 24/7 shifts instead of 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Another challenge is finding available beds. So a quick story about a unhoused neighbor named Anna. It was a staffer that worked in one of the council offices. It was like late at night on a Thursday. I was trying to find a bed for this individual who came to one of their events and said, "I'd like housing. I'm in to go into shelter. I don't want to sleep outside today." Anna had a dog with her and also had a history of domestic violence against her. And so they were trying to call around to these different shelters or bridge housing sites to find her a bed. The first place didn't accept pets, so they had to try another place. The second place was just in a different part of town that Anna didn't want to go to because it was far away. The third place looked like they were going to take her. Then they found out she had been a victim of domestic violence and said, "No, we can't take her because there's a risk that that person will come and try to commit more violence and then put people at the shelter, staff and participants in danger." And so that left domestic violence shelters that were all full, and Anna slept out again at night. And so it's just a brief story of just how many more beds that we really need of all types. Quickly, places that we're going, and then I'll open it up to questions. Obviously, we started with the main issue here is poverty and lack of housing and housing costs. We need to build a lot of housing. Estimated that LA needs 500,000 new affordable units. And if you can just think about that number in your mind, 500,000 units is a lot of units. And they need to be at a rate people can afford. Private sector may not be willing to build all that. So if the government was to try to build those from scratch, that could cost $50 to $100 billion, which, as you can imagine, government doesn't have. You know, remember the bond measure that cleared the 2/3 threshold, but not by a ton, got us 1.2 billion, not 100 billion. And then there's efforts to create different types of housing. So shared housing, rapid rehousing, PSH that we talked about before, bridge housing, all of these. I can talk about the typologies if folks are interested. Another thing on the horizon is the Judge Carter case. You might have read about this judge, federal judge. There's currently a group of downtown property owners that sued the city and the county and said, homelessness is terrible. It's bad for the people who are homeless, even though it's the downtown property owners who are mostly trying to figure out how to just get folks out of downtown. The advocates intervened and obviously did not want a case that was directed by property owners. And we're all in this big discussion with this judge trying to create a global settlement to really figure out how does that leadership come in? How do we figure out who's in charge and get a roadmap that people can agree to? So far, it's led to a 6,000 bed agreement between the city and the county, temporary beds over the next 10 months. Some changes that could really help on the county, state, and Fed level. County level, they've been working on piloting a mental health care model that's a high intensity mental health care. And by high intensity, I mean lots of touch, lots of like one-on-one work between the mental health provider with like only a couple of clients. It's shown a lot of promise in Trieste, which is in Italy, but it is very expensive. Working towards that 24/7 staffing that we mentioned. And the county is working on closing closing jails and not building a new jail, which has been a big debate, and building a big mental health facility instead. At the state level, there's some safe use bills going forward. Safe use is for substance abuse. One of the big challenges we have with substance abuse is that because it's illegal, it's very hard for outreach providers to work with people and actually try to help them get the services they need because they're always afraid to go anywhere near where government is. safe use bills would enable local jurisdictions to create safe use places where someone could be under medical supervision while they use whatever substance that they are addicted to, and then be connected to ways to maybe get off those drugs, but also just other forms of services that they may need. There's also housing reform and maybe more state funding. And then the big one's the federal level. Going back to the mental health care slide, one of the big issues we have is that we just don't get enough as a country. We don't invest in social services like other countries do. We're the only whatever it is, trying to think of the phrase, but basically well-funded country that doesn't have universal health care. So depending on what happens in November, we might see expanded Section 8 vouchers that are worth more in Los Angeles based on our cost of living. We might get more assistance for veterans who make up a solid share, a disproportionate share of homelessness. And we may get more money again, which are called community development block grants. Last, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. There's a lot of debates happening at the city. Should cleanups continue, which is under a section called 5611? And does LAPD go out with the sanitation department when they work to clean up homeless encampments or not? And does LAUSD, the service provider, still go with the sanitation department, or do they go at a different time? There's been a continual debate over the sit, lie, sleep law. Under Boise, that case, the Ninth Circuit case, it says that you could define more defined rules. And one of the council members had proposed that, basically 4118 not apply certain areas, but apply around schools and parks or around homeless housing. So should that go forward or not? What does the city do about enforcing ADA law? Right now, a lot of people who, use wheelchairs or have strollers, really have a tough time getting around city sidewalks right now because there are a lot of encampments that block the full sidewalk, and the city isn't currently doing a lot to try to make sure that there is ADA access so we have equitable access to our sidewalks. That's a question out there. Managed encampments, should we make some of the encampments that exist semi-permanent and get them bathrooms and trash service? And then there's a bunch of new models of housing, pallet shelter, shipping containers, all of that. And then of course the perennial debate of should LA build public restrooms across the city. With that, I hope that wasn't too much too fast, but I'm down to open it up to Q&A on anything I covered or anything I didn't.